May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our freedom. Amen. Please be seated. I once heard someone say that if you don't occasionally hear a child crying, then your church is dying. So I'm always encouraged by the various noises made by the little ones among us. 1870 was the year that this parish, Christ Episcopal Church, was founded. It was also the year that the great French novelist, who I've been getting into recently, Alexandre Dumas, died, 1870. I don't know quite how I got into him. I guess it was one of the gospel readings that got me into him. But I just learned last night that one of his famous classic novels is being portrayed at the Ferndale Repertory Theater, starring our choir director, David Powell. So make sure you go see that. Alexandre Dumas also wrote The Man with the Iron Mask, and one of my favorites is The Count of Monte Cristo. I think that's what came to mind when I was reading the gospel for this morning. I remember this particular passage from The Count of Monte Cristo, in which the protagonist, Edmond Dantes, has this conversation with a Catholic priest and his great mentor, Abbe Faria, in the Chateau d'If, which is a prison island in which they have both been wrongfully sentenced. And just moments before dying, Abbe Faria said to Edmond Dantes, "Here is your final lesson. Do not commit the crime for which you now serve the sentence." In other words, do not seek revenge. For God said, "Vengeance is mine." Edmond Dantes responded by saying, "I don't believe in God." "It doesn't matter," Abbe Faria replied. "He believes in you." I sense a similar kind of wisdom being offered in our gospel reading this morning, in which the apostles asked Jesus, "Increase our faith," as if faith were something to be quantified and used to make God love us more, or worse, to try to control and manipulate God. Jesus' response to the disciples' request invites them to do the same thing that Abbe Faria invites Edmond Dantes to do, to turn their focus away from themselves and away from how much faith they can acquire or accumulate. Rather, turn their focus towards their God, who loves them no matter what, who longs for their healing and wholeness, and who believes in them regardless of how much or how little they might believe in him. As Bishop N.T. Wright says, you don't need great faith, you need faith in a great God. And this is what Jesus, I believe, is teaching in his own unique and challenging and sometimes disturbing way. The story he tells is challenging about the slaves who see themselves as worthless and undeserving of their master's gratitude. They sound off-putting to us today. It sounds a little off-putting to me. But again, I believe this is Jesus' way of saying it's not about you or how much you believe or how much theological education you might have or about how many Bible verses you've memorized. It's about God's unconditional love for you and your openness to receiving and sharing that love. All of our church doctrines and dogmas and creeds and Bible verses are good and necessary, but they are ultimately worthless in and of themselves. They are only helpful insofar as they do what they have been ordered to do, to lead us in to God's love. All of these things, our doctrines, our scriptures, our faith, our liturgy are all slaves to God's love. Even this gorgeous building, which was recently plucked like a brand from the burning, and for which I give thanks to God every day, is still a slave to God's love. The book of Lamentations offers this same message as it describes in poetic and gruesome detail the enormous suffering that the people of Judah endured in losing all the great symbols of their faith, especially their glorious temple. They lost their king, they lost their capital, their safety, their health, and their freedom, and so much more. With all of this gone, they were left with only one thing, and the one thing that mattered: God's love for them. They came to the realization that everything they have ever enjoyed in this world, their temple, their health, their money, was all intended to bring them to receive and share God's love. And even with all of that gone, God's love still remains. Amen. Amen. Whatever he said, amen. Together we just read the conclusion to the book of Lamentations, which is in chapter 3, even though it's got more chapters. Ancient Near Eastern texts have what is called a chiastic structure, which means that the conclusion of the text does not come at the end, but rather right in the middle. And that is what we just read in Lamentations chapter 3. The central conclusion in which the author says, "The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me." In other words, I've lost everything that ever brought me joy. Everything that made me experience God's love has been ripped away from me. But, he continues, "This I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness, O Lord. Great is thy faithfulness." That's the only real positive thing in that whole book. But that's the conclusion. And it stands out so much more gloriously in the midst of all the pain and suffering. I want to teach you a Hebrew word that the Bible translates as steadfast love. It's used hundreds of times throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. The word is chesed. Chesed. If you have trouble making that guttural ch sound, which I love to make, you can just say hesed, like H-E-S-E-D, hesed. And there's no great translation for this word, but steadfast love is pretty good. Chesed is God's unconditional commitment and eternal affection for you. It's associated with the love expressed through a covenant, a holy agreement or commitment. It's often translated as covenant love. But the chesed of God remains available to us even when we mess up, even when we break our part of the covenant. The chesed of God never ceases. Our love for God and our belief in God are good and need to be cultivated. But ultimately, our job is to rest in God's love for us, God's belief in us, God's chesed. Because even when we doubt God, his steadfast love for us never ceases. Even when we don't believe, God believes in us. The theme for our 150th anniversary is steadfast and growing since 1870. And we have been steadfast indeed. We just heard this wonderful history from Catherine Mace yesterday about our 150 years of being steadfast. And we are now growing in ways we cannot yet even imagine. And we have been resilient in the face of some serious challenges. This church has been the victim of vandalism for 150 years. This is just the last in a long string of attacks. And we should celebrate our resilience and our history and our growth. But more than all of that, we are called to, as we say in our mission statement, glorify God. Glorify God by simply resting in his steadfast love, resting in God's Chesed. It is God's love that can move mountains and uproot trees, and we can participate in that divine power not so much by prophesying or preaching or speaking in tongues or increasing our faith, but by simply resting in God's love, by basking in our belovedness. As the Apostle Paul said beautifully, if I speak in tongues of men or of angels but do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. It's worthless. It's all worthless without love. All that matters is receiving and sharing God's steadfast love, God's chesed. I invite you now to rest in God's chesed. I invite you to rest in God's steadfast love as you hear these words of a poem by a 17th century Anglican priest, George Herbert. You should have a copy in your bulletin. I invite you to let these words wash over you so that you may know in your bones and sinews that no matter how much or how little you believe in God, God believes in you. And God's steadfast love for you never ceases. The poem is appropriately titled Love. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful? Ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat.